Yeah, I was offered certain, amounts of money to do the old songs.
After decades, Bob Dylan finally confirms the rumors. In the mythology of American music, truth and mystery have always walked side by side, and no one has guarded that line more fiercely than Dylan. His voice became a map of the 20th century, defiant, poetic, untouchable. And yet, behind every lyric, every cryptic interview, the question lingered: how much of Dylan was real, and how much was myth? For years, the rumors surrounded him like smoke, about lost loves and secret betrayals, about ghostwriters, faith, fame, and that night in 1966 when he turned electric and shattered his own following. But Dylan never confirmed, never denied, only smiled through the haze and let the stories grow in the silence. Now, in a rare confession, the man who once said he'd rather be misunderstood than misquoted has finally spoken, and what he revealed doesn't just rewrite the gossip, it rewires the legend. Because what Dylan admits after half a century isn't scandal. It's something far more human. It's a revelation about truth, time, and the price of keeping your soul in tune with the world's noise, and it begins with the moment that changed everything, the night Bob Dylan decided to stop being a prophet and start being a man. Electric Judas, the night Dylan broke his own gospel. When Dylan plugged in at Newport in 1965, he wasn't chasing rebellion, he was escaping reverence. The booze weren't what haunted him, the worship did. For the first time, he admits the roar that night wasn't liberation, it was panic. He realized the prophet everyone loved was already starting to feel like a cage. To most of America, that night marked the death of folk purity, but to Dylan, it was the birth of honesty. He had been canonized too young, turned into a mouthpiece for causes he barely believed in. The marches, the manifestos, the endless interviews demanding meaning, it all became a weight too heavy to sing beneath. He wasn't angry at his audience, he was afraid of their faith. They wanted a leader, but I was barely learning how to follow myself. When he lifted that Fender Stratocaster under the festival lights, he wasn't making history, he was making distance. Each distorted chord was a declaration that he refused to be anyone's saint. The crowd wanted purity, he offered electricity. The sound cracked open the summer air, chaotic, alive, unholy, and suddenly the folk hero was gone. In his place stood something rawer, louder, and painfully real. The backlash was instantaneous. Fans shouted betrayal, critics called it treason. The same people who once praised his truth now demanded his silence. But Dylan had already crossed the line between prophet and person. The feedback that screeched from his amplifiers was his answer, a wall of sound to drown out the expectations. He later said, "It wasn't about going electric, it was about staying alive." That statement became his quiet manifesto. Staying alive for Dylan meant evolution. Folk music had become ritual, a kind of moral theatre dressed as rebellion. He wanted art that breathed, that bled, that didn't care whether it was understood. In that moment he traded applause for authenticity. The crowd's outrage was proof he'd finally told the truth. As the last notes faded into chaos, someone shouted, "Judas!" from the dark. Dylan's reply was calm, cold, unforgettable. "I don't believe you." The words cut through the noise like a hymn for heretics. That night he didn't just plug in a guitar, he short-circuited the myth of purity itself. When he walked off stage, the world saw betrayal, but Dylan saw rebirth. The prophet of protest had become the architect of reinvention, and in that act of defiance, he proved something few artists ever dare to, that sometimes the only way to stay honest is to let the faithful down. Echo of Joan, love before the legend. She wasn't just his partner in protest, she was his reflection before fame blurred the edges. Dylan now confesses that walking away from Baez wasn't pride, it was cowardice. "She saw me," he says, "too well." He could face the crowds, the critics, the crown of thorns, but not the woman who knew the man behind it all. In the beginning, they were two voices moving in harmony against the noise of a divided country. Baez was already a force, graceful, articulate, pure in conviction. Dylan was her unlikely counterpart, scruffy and defiant, with lyrics that seemed to arrive from another world. She brought him into her spotlight, onto her stages, and into her cause. Their bond was more than romance, it was a revolution sung in 2 octaves. But fame corrodes intimacy, and soon the love that once sounded eternal began to unravel between microphone stands and miles of road. She believed music could heal, he believed it could hurt honestly. Her gaze sought truth, his eyes were already fixed on escape. The gentle boy she had discovered in New York's coffeehouses began turning into an enigma, one more interested in myth than memory. As the 60s roared, Dylan outgrew the folk world that had first embraced him, and Baez with it. When he picked up an electric guitar, she watched as he traded conviction for chaos. The songs that once united them now divided them. She stood backstage in silence, tears burning as fans booed, realizing she'd lost not just a partner, but a kind of faith. Years later, he admitted, "I didn't leave her because I stopped loving her. I left because she reminded me of who I was before the noise." Baez turned heartbreak into music, pouring her grief into ballads that carried both pain and grace. Dylan, meanwhile, retreated into layers of metaphor, burying sincerity beneath riddles. He rarely spoke of her, but she haunted his writing, appearing as whispers, ghosts, and glances between lines. To the public, they were icons of an era. To each other, they were unfinished business. Their eventual reunions, those brief, fragile duets, decades later, felt less like nostalgia and more like reckoning. They smiled, they sang, and in every shared lyric was an apology neither could quite speak aloud. The crowd heard history, they heard forgiveness. "She sang the truth," he said, "and I couldn't stand hearing it in my own voice." Time made them both immortal, but only one of them remained unguarded. Baez was still singing for the world. Dylan was still hiding from it. She had loved the man, the world loved the myth, and he would spend the rest of his life wishing they had never become the same thing. Basement sanctuary, when silence became survival. In Woodstock, Dylan traded the spotlight for a basement microphone and a handful of friends. Fans thought he'd vanished. He says he was finally breathing. "I didn't disappear," he recalls. "I came home." The songs from that exile weren't experiments. They were exorcisms. Hiding was the only way he could stay real. After the motorcycle crash in 1966, rumors multiplied faster than facts. Some said he'd been paralyzed, others whispered he'd gone insane. But the truth, Dylan later admitted, was simpler. The crash was both an ending and a rescue. For years he'd been trapped inside the machinery of fame, praised as a prophet, followed like a messiah, quoted like scripture. The accident didn't break him. It freed him from the role he never wanted. He left the cities behind and settled in Woodstock, New York, surrounded by his wife, children, and a small circle of friends who called themselves the Band. Together they gathered in the basement of a weathered pink house, the walls lined with guitars and tape machines. They met in the mornings, playing without set lists or plans. The air was thick with laughter, cigarette smoke, and the relief of being forgotten. It was music stripped of ceremony, a rebirth disguised as routine. What emerged would later be known as the basement tapes. They weren't meant for release, and that was the secret to their magic. Each song was raw and unfinished, a heartbeat recorded on magnetic tape. Folk, country, gospel, and nonsense blended into something both ancient and new. Dylan was rediscovering the sound of imperfection, the kind of truth that can't survive under stage lights. "We weren't making records," he said. "We were making sense of being alive." The irony was that his disappearance only amplified his legend. As bootlegs leaked, musicians across the world clung to his ghost. The Beatles, weary from their own fame, studied the looseness of his new sound. The Byrds built albums in its shadow. Dylan had fled to find his humanity and accidentally reinvented authenticity. The man who tried to vanish became the compass for everyone else. Years later, he explained what the world mistook for mystery. It wasn't strategy or secrecy. It was survival. "I wasn't hiding from people," he said. "I was hiding from what they turned me into." That basement became more than a studio. It was his sanctuary, a place where sound could breathe and meaning could sleep. In the hum of tape reels and the murmur of friendship, Dylan found the quiet he'd been chasing his whole life. And in that silence, the prophet finally became a man again. Songs in red, the heartbreak behind the masterpiece. For years, Dylan insisted Blood on the Tracks was fiction. Now he admits it was written on the ruins of truth. Each verse a wound, each chorus a confession. He wasn't documenting love lost, he was surviving it. "You can't lie when you're bleeding," he says quietly. "The songs always know when you do." By the mid-70s, Dylan's life had begun to collapse inward. The marriage that once anchored him was fracturing. The domestic calm of Woodstock had turned into emotional fog. He fled into music the way others flee into prayer. The result was Blood on the Tracks, an album that sounded less like a record and more like a reckoning. Every lyric felt carved from guilt and memory, every melody a letter he never sent. He told interviewers that the songs were stories, not autobiography. It was a shield, thin but necessary. Behind it, he was writing the most vulnerable music of his life. Simple Twist of Fate, Tangled Up in Blue, If You See Her, Say Hello, each one pulled from the wreckage of a love too real to name. Friends who watched him during those sessions said the pain was palpable. He sang not to create, but to exercise. The recording mirrored the turmoil. Sessions in New York were tense, brittle, full of unfinished takes and unspoken anger. Dylan kept rewriting verses between takes, chasing a truth he couldn't face. When he brought the tapes to Minnesota to re-record, the songs changed shape again, less bitter, more resigned. It was as though he was trying to heal by rearranging the wounds. To the listener, the album is poetry. To Dylan, it was therapy that almost failed. He once said, "I thought I could outrun the hurt by turning it into rhyme, but it stayed just behind me, singing along." The studio became his confessional, the guitar, his only witness. The musicians barely spoke between takes, afraid to interrupt the spell or the sorrow. When Blood on the Tracks was released, critics called it a return to form. They missed the point. This wasn't a comeback. It was survival on tape. The man who had once changed the sound of rebellion was now learning the sound of remorse. Every strum felt like penance, every silence between notes, forgiveness he hadn't yet earned. Years later, Dylan stopped pretending the songs were fiction. He admitted pain has a rhythm you can't fake. "You can't lie when you're bleeding," he said. "The songs always know when you do." Blood on the Tracks became more than an album. It was the diary of a man watching love die in real time and choosing to sing instead of drown. Fire and faith. Dylan's uneasy deal with God. When he began singing about salvation in 1979, fans thought he'd gone mad. He wasn't preaching, he says now, he was bargaining. Those gospel nights weren't triumph, they were surrender. "I wasn't saved," he admits. "I was scared." Faith didn't find him. He chased it, desperate to feel something louder than fame. By the late 70s, Dylan's world had begun to collapse quietly from the inside. The tours continued, the audiences remained loyal, but something in him had broken. The man who once sang truth to power now struggled to hear his own. The cheers felt hollow, the applause like an echo bouncing back from a life he no longer recognized. He'd been a prophet, a rebel, a poet, and now all of it felt meaningless. The fire that once lit his songs had burned out, leaving only smoke. Into that emptiness, faith crept in. The transformation stunned his followers. One moment he was snarling through Tangled Up in Blue, the next he was quoting Revelation from the stage. Gone were the love songs and cryptic parables. In their place came gospel choirs, raised hands, and sermons wrapped in melody. To his fans it looked like delirium. To Dylan it was survival, a desperate search for something untainted by fame or fear. Albums like Slow Train Coming and Saved became the soundtracks of this strange awakening. Critics called him fanatical, friends called him lost, but Dylan pressed on, singing about judgment, sin, and grace as if salvation could be wrestled into submission. These weren't sermons for the world, they were prayers for himself. He later said, "You don't choose faith, it chooses you when everything else stops answering." On tour, he was relentless. Bandmates recall him pacing backstage, reciting scripture before every performance, gripping his Bible like a weapon against doubt. His voice on stage was fierce, trembling, full of both conviction and exhaustion. Some nights he glowed with belief, others he seemed haunted by it. His gospel years weren't about enlightenment, they were about endurance. By the early 80s, the fire began to dim, the sermons quieted, the choirs dissolved, but traces of that struggle lingered in every song that followed. Dylan didn't abandon faith, he absorbed it. The man who once questioned the world had turned the questions inward and found no easy answers. Decades later, when asked what faith had given him, he smiled and said, "I wasn't saved, I was scared." For a man who had already conquered everything, belief became his final rebellion, an act of surrender in a world that worships noise. Wilbury Roads, hiding in harmony. The Traveling Wilburys looked like a supergroup. To Dylan, it was sanctuary disguised as a jam session. He joined Harrison, Petty, and Orbison not to reclaim the spotlight, but to lose it. He says the laughter was louder than the fame. "We were just men again," he recalls. "No myths, no masks, just music." By the late 1980s, Dylan had been carrying the weight of legend for too long. Every song he wrote was analyzed, every silence interpreted. The prophet of the 60s had become a monument to his own mythology, and he wanted out. Then, almost accidentally, freedom appeared, not in a solo project, but in friendship. What began as a casual collaboration among 5 rock icons turned into one of the most joyful musical accidents in history. George Harrison called first. He needed help with a B-side. Dylan showed up, then Tom Petty drifted in, Jeff Lynne followed, and finally Roy Orbison, each a star in his own right, each weary of their own fame. They recorded together in a garage, 5 voices melting into one. It was music without ego, the kind that existed before careers, before critics, before legacy. For Dylan, it was the first time in decades that sound felt simple again. The Wilburys were playful by design. They took fake names, Lucky, Lefty, Otis, Nelson, and Charlie T, and created a mythology that mocked the very fame that had once trapped them. Behind those aliases, Dylan found anonymity again. He didn't have to explain his lyrics or shoulder the burden of meaning. He could just play. "We were just men again," he said. "No myths, no masks, just music." The sessions were loose and alive. They joked, improvised, and finished songs in hours. Harrison brought serenity, Petty brought humor, Orbison brought heart, Dylan brought weight, and then learned how to put it down. Together they created the Traveling Wilburys Volume 1, a record that sounded like laughter set to melody. It won awards, sold millions, and yet, for Dylan, the triumph wasn't commercial. It was personal. For once he wasn't the voice of a generation. He was just another man in the band. There was relief in that ordinariness, in the way the others treated him not as a prophet, but as a peer. Those who saw him during that period described a lighter Dylan, still guarded, but grinning again, as though the music had given him back his humanity. The Wilburys didn't last long. Roy Orbison's death ended their run too soon, and the rest quietly went their separate ways, but that brief chapter mattered more to Dylan than most realized. It wasn't about reinvention, it was about release. The basement years had given him solitude. The Wilburys gave him laughter, and sometimes that's all a man needs to feel alive again. The vanishing voice, when words lost their meaning. During the 80s, Dylan's interviews became puzzles. Fans quoted them like prophecy, but he confesses now, he wasn't being cryptic. He was confused. "They asked me what I meant," he says, "but half the time, I didn't know either." The riddles weren't art. They were armor for a man forgetting how to be understood. The decade that followed his gospel years was a wilderness. Dylan was still recording, still touring, but his creative compass seemed to spin without direction. The man who had once written in lightning now struggled to find the spark. His albums came and went. Infidels, Empire Burlesque, Knocked Out Loaded, each one carrying flashes of brilliance buried under uncertainty. Critics called it decline. Dylan called it drift. He later admitted that he had lost the thread between who he was and what he was supposed to say. Interviews became minefields. He answered questions with riddles, metaphors, and shrugs. To journalists it sounded like mystery. To Dylan, it was simply exhaustion. Fame had turned conversation into interrogation. Every word was dissected, every silence amplified. He stopped trying to clarify anything because clarity had stopped helping. The more he explained himself, the less anyone listened. He once said, "If you say what you mean, people make you a liar. If you don't, they call you a ghost." It was the quiet confession of a man trapped between being a person and being a myth. The riddles weren't performance, they were camouflage. He used language as a fog, not to deceive, but to disappear inside it. On stage, his performances mirrored that confusion. Songs shifted tempo, melodies broke apart, and lyrics mutated from night to night. The audience wanted nostalgia. He gave them reinvention. Even his old anthems felt unfamiliar, as if he were dismantling his own legend one verse at a time. He wasn't rewriting history. He was erasing the expectation that he still belonged to it. For Dylan, that decade became an uneasy truce with silence. He kept touring, chasing the feeling of momentum even when the meaning was gone. The interviews, the concerts, the cryptic lines, they were all part of the same ritual, keeping the machine running so the myth didn't catch up. By the late 80s, the riddles had hardened into habit. Fans still analyzed his every word, but the truth was simpler. He was tired. The poet who once defined a generation had run out of explanations. "They asked me what I meant," he said, "but half the time, I didn't know either." The silence that followed wasn't arrogance. It was surrender. The man who had once made words immortal had finally learned how heavy they could be. The reluctant laureate, when poetry became prison. When Dylan won the Nobel Prize for Literature, he hid in silence. The world called it arrogance. He says it was grief. "They made it sound like an ending," he admits, "but I was still writing." He didn't reject the honor, he feared it, because nothing kills a rebel faster than being called a saint. When the Swedish Academy announced his name in 2016, the world paused in disbelief. A songwriter had just joined the ranks of Hemingway and Eliot. It was a moment that blurred the line between literature and lyric, between song and scripture. For fans, it was vindication. For Dylan, it was a strange kind of funeral. He once described fame as a mask that eats the face. The Nobel, though meant to honor him, felt like another mask, one that threatened to seal him in permanence. He didn't attend the ceremony. Instead, he sent Patti Smith, who performed A Hard Rain's A Gonna Fall in his place. When her voice faltered halfway through, the silence that filled the hall said everything. It was a moment of vulnerability, sincerity, and quiet defiance. All qualities Dylan had spent his life protecting. His absence wasn't rebellion, it was preservation. The man who had built a career on questioning titles refused to sit beneath another crown. Critics called him ungrateful. Others claimed he was simply staying in character, the eternal enigma. But Dylan's silence wasn't calculated. It was instinctive. He had spent decades escaping the trap of identity, from folk hero to electric outlaw, from preacher to poet. The Nobel Prize threatened to turn that lifelong flight into a destination. "I've never written for prizes," he once said. "I've written to breathe." When his acceptance speech arrived months later, it wasn't a manifesto. It was a confession. Dylan spoke not of himself, but of the stories that shaped him. Moby Dick, The Odyssey, all quiet on the Western Front. He positioned his songs not above them, but beside them, as if to say that truth doesn't care about form, it only cares about feeling. He was telling the Academy politely that poetry was never meant to sit still. For Dylan, the Nobel wasn't validation. It was confrontation. It forced him to face the legend he had never asked to become. "They made it sound like an ending," he said, "but I was still writing." In the end, he accepted the prize because he had to, but he met it on his own terms, quietly, humbly, and slightly out of reach. The world crowned him a poet. Dylan just wanted to stay human. Rumors in the blood, the lies that kept him human. For decades, he let myths breathe for him, stories of secret wives, lost tapes, hidden writers. Now he admits the truth behind the noise. "Some were lies I started," he says. "They made the real things harder to find." Each rumor, he confesses, was a mask he wore so the music could stay naked. From the beginning, Dylan understood that mystery was more powerful than truth. Fame devoured explanations. It needed stories to feed on. In a world that demanded meaning from every lyric and intention behind every silence, he learned to confuse the trail. When journalists hunted him, he gave them riddles. When fans tried to find the man, he handed them mirrors. The result was a mythology so vast that even he sometimes got lost inside it. The rumors were endless. Some claimed he'd vanished to live under another name. Others said he'd joined secret communes, written albums for other artists, or faked entire eras of his career. There were whispers of marriages that never existed, children who weren't his, or songs he didn't write. To Dylan, it all became part of the theater. "If you're going to be misunderstood," he once said, "you might as well get good at it." His silence only amplified the myths. When he stopped giving interviews, fans filled the gaps themselves. They wanted an oracle, not a man. The less he said, the more sacred his words became. He learned that the lie wasn't the enemy, it was the buffer. The stories protected him from the audience that wanted to consume him whole. They kept the sacred and the personal from bleeding into one another. But behind the curtain of fables, Dylan was quietly watching it all unravel. He began to see how his own survival depended on contradiction. He needed to vanish to stay visible, to distort the truth so that the songs could remain clear. The rumors were armor, heavy, necessary, and impossible to remove without losing the person underneath. They made the real things harder to find, he admitted later. By the time the internet arrived, the old mysteries started to dissolve under the floodlight of constant speculation. Dylan no longer needed to invent lies. They were being written for him faster than he could deny them. But the lesson had already been learned. Mystery was not deceit. It was survival. He laughs about it now, the way only someone battle-scarred by fame can. The rumors, he says, became his blood. They flowed through the art, staining every note with uncertainty, keeping it alive. The man may have hidden, but the music never did. That, perhaps, was the greatest truth in all the lies he ever told. The final verse, the man behind the echo. After a lifetime of reinvention, Dylan says the secret was simple. "I never wanted to change the world, just to keep from vanishing." Every disguise, every silence, every rumor, It all led here. The myth was never the lie. The lie was thinking it mattered more than the man who whispered beneath it. Looking back, Dylan's story isn't about transformation, it's about endurance. He didn't shape culture by chasing it. He survived it by staying one step ahead, then stepping away altogether. From the folk cafes of Greenwich Village to the electric roar of Newport, from gospel sermons to garage laughter, his journey reads like a man learning to live inside his own shadow. Every reinvention wasn't rebellion, it was preservation, a quiet resistance against becoming a relic of his own time. What kept him alive wasn't fame or fortune, it was motion. Dylan never lingered long enough for the world to decide who he was. The moment they thought they'd caught him, he was already gone, moving toward another sound, another truth. To him, the art was never about arrival. It was about staying lost with purpose. He once said, "If you're not busy being born, you're busy dying." As years passed, the myth only grew heavier. Every lyric was dissected, every silence interpreted. But the man beneath, the one who walked back to his dressing room, guitar in hand, remained invisible by choice. His genius wasn't in what he revealed, but in what he withheld. Dylan turned mystery into armor, and wore it until it became his second skin. He understood that the artist dies the moment he becomes understandable. Even now, when he does speak, it's never to explain. It's to remind the world that explanation is the enemy of art. His songs, like old prayers, keep changing shape each time they're sung. What once sounded like rebellion now feels like reflection. What once felt like prophecy now echoes as memory. He no longer performs to prove anything. He plays to stay human, to keep the music alive long after the noise fades. Those close to him describe a man both restless and content, still scribbling on napkins, still chasing fragments of melodies no one else can hear. The voice may have aged, but the fire behind it burns with the same defiance. The myth continues, but Dylan no longer hides inside it. He simply lets it breathe on its own. And perhaps that's the final verse, the quiet realization that the greatest act of rebellion was never the protest song or the electric guitar. It was the refusal to disappear. Dylan didn't change the world. He just refused to fade from it, and that in the end was enough. Legacy is a strange thing. It begins as noise, then settles into silence. Bob Dylan's story was never about the spotlight. It was about the shadows he chose to stand in. For 60 years, he shaped the language of rebellion, heartbreak, and faith, then quietly stepped aside to watch what the world made of it. His greatness isn't measured by the songs he wrote, but by the distance he kept from the myth they created. In the end, Dylan reminds us that art isn't about arrival, it's about survival. He didn't chase immortality, he just kept moving until it caught up. The songs remain because they were never his alone. They belong to anyone still searching for meaning in the noise. What do you think Dylan's greatest disguise was? Share your thoughts below.